So in 2015, actually March 31st of 2015, I had to go out to Camarillo, California, and pick up a helicopter. There was a flight instructor down in Arkansas, had a student that had actually purchased a helicopter from Orbit Helicopters out in Camarillo. He didn't quite have his license done yet, and the other flight instructor was not real comfortable with flying through LA airspace. He knew that I had a lot of experience flying in LA in the past, and so he contacted me, and I agreed to go out and get the helicopter. So I flew in on March 31st to LAX, and the plan was for the student and his wife were going to actually pick me up at LAX. We would just drive over to Camarillo, and his wife would drop us off. We'd pick up the aircraft and head out, and then she was going to drive back to LAX, drop off the rental car and grab an airliner home. On my way out there, I had, didn't leave St. Louis here until, I don't know, 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, which is 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning out in LA, and or 6 o'clock, whatever. And as I was checking the weather at Camarillo, the weather was pretty crappy. It was ceilings were 400 to 600 feet and that sort of thing. And when I arrived in Los Angeles, expecting to be going to Camarillo, and as luck would have it, every day as the temperatures come up towards the later part of the day, that usually the weather is quite good, and it was true that day as well. As luck would have it, we ended up having to. There was a service bulletin came out one day prior on March 30th for a modification to R44 rotor blades that had to be done, and so we ended up having to modify the rotor blades, and that ended up putting us one day behind. We ended up didn't leave until the next day. Some of the modification of the rotor blade took a bit of time. Some of the sealant that you put in the rotor blade had to cure for like 12 hours, and then they had to be painted after that. So that ended up putting us leaving the next morning. I was concerned with that because again, leaving out, our plan initially was to basically run along the 101 or up through the high terrain there and around through to LA. I was concerned that if we got a similar weather that morning, April 1st, that it was going to be an issue. So I just decided at that point, I talked to the student and said, hey, you know what, we're going to run the low-level way of getting around to Los Angeles. And essentially that was, and I'll show you what we did here. So here's Camarillo, California. You'll notice the elevation at Camarillo is only 77 feet above sea level. And the hills actually start about here and run out to the east. This entire area and through here is all relatively high terrain here. So what we did was we left out of Camarillo, and the weather, our plan was to transition down and transition through Point Mugu Naval Air Station's airspace and pick up the Pacific Coast Highway here and just run along the Pacific Coast Highway. And that's what we did. We went all the way around by Malibu here and came around to transition through Santa Monica's airspace, did the shoreline transition here at just off the end of LAX, and continued on down into Torrance's airspace, landed at Torrance here, and refueled. And basically from that point on, the flight was no different from a lot of the flights I'd done in the past from Torrance back to Missouri, taking new Robinson helicopters for delivery. And the reason I mention it is once I had made the decision that we weren't going to go through the high terrain and have any concerns with any decreased visibility in the next morning, I was able to sort of forget about it, and my stress level went way down. I decided, we're going to take the route that I know we can get there without any great difficulty. It turns out it's a much more scenic route. That's kind of a route that most people would never get to fly, and so it worked out pretty well. In the next part of this, we're going to cover some recommendations for things, and these are not necessarily things you're going to find in your instrument training books. They're sort of recommendations from experience. So.